So we've called this talk hidden in plain sight, because I'm looking for something that we weren't sure was there, but which we thought has probably been there all along, and that's evidence of women's engagement with academic medical text, very broadly conceived, um, historically, so before 1715. And in order to give some context, I'm going to talk a bit about the collection where I'm working and why we have decided to do this project. So the picture that you can see now is one wall of the Dorchester Library at the Royal College of Physicians. And so roughly a quarter of the library, the books in that space. So it's a very large collection of medical books, of historic medical books. The college was founded in 1518. It's an academic body, and it was originally set up as a means of regulating the practice of medicine within the city of London. Admission was restricted to graduates at Oxford and Cambridge, with candidates from other universities permitted only from 1835. And originally, there was nothing that said that women couldn't join, but as women were excluded from Oxford and Cambridge, and the college only admitted graduates from those colleges, there was no way for women to become eligible to join. And in fact, it's only been very recently in the college's history that women have become involved. The fellows rejected a proposal to accept women as members in 1895. The first woman fellow wasn't elected until 1953, and that was Helen Mackay. And the first woman elected president of the college was Dame Margaret Turner Warwick in 1989. So a very recent event in the college's history has been women's involvement. Women currently make up about 28% of the medical workforce, so that's doctors within the medical specialties, and 39% of current members and 27% of current fellows are women. So we're still a long way from 50%. And in the 200 years that followed the college being founded, the practice of medicine underwent a process of professionalization, and women were mainly excluded from this because they were not able to register as practitioners and not able to enroll at university. But despite that, many women participated in activities related to medicine, including working as apothecaries, providing healthcare within the domestic sphere, and practicing midwifery. And women were also consumers and creators of printed medical knowledge. And that's what this project is really about. So I am working to identify and document evidence of this consumption and creation of medical knowledge by women in each of the approximately 7,000 books that were printed before 1715. 1715 is a bit of an arbitrary cutoff. For practical reasons, to make the task manageable, 7,000 is plenty. And there was a surge in publishing in the later stages of the 18th century. So looking at the 18th century alone would double the scope of this project. So what it means in practice is that for each of these books that you can see here, I have taken every single one of them down off the shelf individually. I have looked at every single page of them and documented evidence of women's engagement with them. So women writing their names in the books, women credited as authors, women credited as publishers or printers. And the reason for doing this is that provenance information related to women, so that means information related to women who previously owned these books, has historically been excluded from library catalogues. So one of the main aims of this project is to put those women back into library catalogues. So if you go to the RCP catalogue now and you look up a book, so you find a book, it will tell you the names of previous male owners. So men's books can be traced. And women are not usually included, although there are some there now as a result of recent efforts. And that's from this project and also from earlier work by the librarians. And the reasons for this are complex, but they're essentially related to the standards required by professional cataloguing practice. So anyone that gets added to the catalogue needs to be identifiable in public records. And historically, women have been very difficult to trace through public records, not least because they often take their husband's name, and they are therefore often absent or unidentifiable in the archive. RCP have made a policy decision to include women that I have identified from the books to their catalogue, and they will be added in even if they can't be identified or verified elsewhere. So the books that we can see have been bequeathed to the college by members and fellows, and so they represent the priorities and interests of doctors over a long period of time. And in addition to texts that we might identify as medical, many of the books reflect the wide scope of the university education that was required of early fellows. So the humanist medicine that was practiced at the time that the college was founded depended on a thorough understanding, not just of sciences, but also the liberal arts. And despite the college wanting books and having books and people donating books, they didn't build a library, so that's a room specifically for books, and until the middle of the 17th century. The building costs were met by William Harvey, who you can see in the middle there, and the collection was expanded after fellows donated money to buy books and also gifts of manuscripts and printed books, included in Persian and Arabic, which are still in the collection. And one of these early catalogues lists just over 1,200 books in the library at that time. So that was 1660. And the books covered topics as wide-ranging as cookery, optics, theology, as well as disciplines more obviously related to medicine like anatomy and natural history. And unfortunately, the museum objects and almost all of the books were lost when the college was destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666. And this is my first forgotten or lost woman. This is Eleanor Boswell, who's an American scholar. When I started doing this project, I thought that I was going to find lots of women's names in books, some of whom we would be able to identify and find out about, and others who would remain just a name. And I wasn't prepared to find evidence of 20th century women working on the collection whose work had also been overlooked. So the first woman that needs to be put back on the historical record is, in fact, Eleanor Boswell. So in 1929, she came to the college as a research fellow. She identified 85 books in the collection that had survived the fire. But unfortunately, her work was dismissed by the college staff and has also been dismissed by later historians. And it's been referred to very dismissively as Ms. Boswell's researches. But in fact, Eleanor Boswell was a Guggenheim Fellow with a doctorate in early modern English literature, and she won the Rosemary Crawshay Prize in 1933, so the British Academy Literary Prize. So she was a serious scholar with a impressive academic pedigree, but as she didn't fit in with the profile of other historians working on medicine, who at that time were also mainly doctors, her work was dismissed. And in fact, there's still no clear consensus as to which of the books in the library survived the fire today, and identifying them is actually pretty tricky. Many of the books that are in the collection have dates that are earlier than the fire, and the acquisition documentation is often incomplete, with lots of records being lost in the various site moves that the college has had since 1666. So Eleanor Boswell's work remains probably the best chance that we have of identifying what remains of the original Royal College of Physicians collection from before the Great Fire of London. So Boswell's experience demonstrates that it's not just very early women that have been dismissed from the historical record, but also women scholars who've been working on collections have been historically overlooked. So one of the things that I want to make sure of is that her work is appropriately acknowledged. So that aim has also been adopted into the project. And just putting to one side for a moment the issue of Eleanor Boswell's scholarship being overlooked, the fire in 1666 clearly left the college without a building and without a room for a library and with far fewer books, because only a few were saved. So they turned to this chap. This is Henry Pierrepont. He was a colourful character and studied medicine and the law. He was admitted to Gray's Inn in 1651 and called to the bar in 1652. And those activities led to him becoming the subject of quite a lot of ridicule amongst the aristocracy. He was created Marquess of Dorchester in 1645 for services to the crown. But despite the ridicule, he enjoyed a long association with the college and became the first honorary fellow in 1658. Um, and it's quite probable that the reason that he was indulged so much by the physicians was because of his books. He made a significant donation to buy books for the college, and the core of the current collection is made up of books that once were owned by him, and that's why the library is named the Dorchester Library after him. And the accepted narrative, and this is what you'll hear if you go on tours of the college, is that he bequeathed his collection of books to the college to replace those lost in the fire. He died in 1680 after unsuccessfully treating his own gangrenous leg. And despite the fact that it is widely accepted that he's left his books to the college, he in fact left all his books to his daughter, Lady Grace Pierrepont. And there's no evidence at all that he left the books to the college. So there is another example here of women being left out of the narrative of collection building. Here is Grace. Grace did go on to donate the books that once belonged to her father to the college. But there's a lot of ambivalence about this in the college records, and it seems to have been very, very difficult for 19th and 20th century doctors and historians in particular to accept that this collection was in fact left to a woman, was owned by a woman, and was bequeathed to the college by a woman. And if you go back and look through the college records, there's a lot of talk about the fact that Lord Dorchester must have left the books in trust to Lady Grace for the college, because it seemed inconceivable that he could leave them to a woman. There's no evidence offered for this supposition that the books were left in trust, and unfortunately, this idea has been repeated in almost all published research related to the history of the library. So it's really quite striking how problematic this fact seems to have been to those writing the history of the college in the 19th and 20th century. So another example of women being excluded from the historical record here. In contrast, back in the 17th century, the fellows were very comfortable with the idea of Grace Pierrepont as a benefactor, and she was thanked in the Harveian oration of 1697. So this discomfort at women's agency, it seems to be a later phenomenon. We don't know an awful lot about Grace Pierrepont's early life. We know that she was a lady in waiting to Queen Anne, and she lived in London. And this painting of her is displayed at the family seat, home Pierrepont Hall near Nottingham. There's no evidence that Grace was particularly interested in the content of the books in any way, but she was actively involved in the conveyancing of Dorchester's properties, including of the Dorchester House in Highgate, which is where Lord Dorchester's library was kept. And she maintained possession of the books until 1686. So for 6 years after her father's death, she hung on to this large collection of books. The college resolved to build a new library to try and convince her to hand the books over, and they commissioned Christopher Wren to design the space in 1686. Grace was invited to inspect the new library and eventually gave the books to the college to be installed in this new space that was designed by Wren. So there's no evidence that she had any direct involvement with Wren's work, but she did hold on to those books until the college had built a suitable place for them. And there's plenty of evidence of concern amongst the fellows that if they didn't complete the work to her approval, she might decide to hang on to those books and not give the books to the college today. Um, and because of her commitment to hanging on to those books and ensuring that the college did a good job at building a library and that and in engaging Christopher Wren to do that work, it's possible for us to draw a visual line between Grace Pierrepont and Christopher Wren's design and the Dorchester Library as it is today. And by that, I mean that the library looks the way it does now because Dennis Lasdon, who designed the current RCP building at Regent's Park, included very strong visual references to previous library designs because he wanted the library to be recognizable as the library in the previous building, which is in Pall Mall. And that library, in turn, was designed to reflect the previous library design by Wren. So there's been a consistency in what the library looks like, a very typical gentleman's library in appearance. And the reason that Lasdon did this was because he recognized that the library was a focal point of the college life and a really key component of its institutional identity. So he wanted the space to be recognizable as the college library. And he did this using the books that were given by Grace Pierrepont. So Grace Pierrepont's actions in insisting on the library design being executed to a high standard and by only then giving the books is still evident in the design that we see today. I've just secured funding for an installation in this library space to recognise the contribution of Grace Pierrepont. At the moment, the information panel, which I think you can just see on the screen, my cursor has disappeared. Here we are. So under William Harvey, there's an information panel and it gives a bit of information about the history of the library. It doesn't mention Grace Pierrepont at all. It mentions simply Lord Dorchester, although college staff do now mention Grace when giving tours. And the Pierrepont family have agreed to lend the portrait of Grace Pierrepont. So we're going to hang it where William Harvey currently is. So it will be at the centre of college life for the duration of the installation. And an exhibition about the library and the collection will run alongside. And it's often said that women's work is largely invisible and is only made visible in its absence. That was Angela Davis talking about domestic work mainly. So, for example, we notice when beds aren't made and the floors aren't cleaned. But they can be applied very effectively here too, because the Dorchester Library's visual impact, which is hugely important to the institutional identity of the college, would be incredibly different and much reduced without the books that were once owned by Grace Pierrepont and other women, who I will come to, and without the work that Grace did in ensuring that the college designed a library that was fit to receive the collection. And I want to demonstrate and make visible that contribution. And originally, I had the idea that removing the books would be a good way to do this, but that creates all kinds of logistical challenges. They take up an awful lot of space, and the very act of me going through them one at a time has been incredibly disrupted to the library and to the way that the college uses this room. So taking thousands of books away all in one go would be incredibly disruptive, not to mention there's nowhere else to put them. So instead, we have decided to wrap the books that were donated by Grace Pierrepont and were were once owned by other women in a contrasting colour so that they're clearly visible when entering the library. And just to give an idea of the scale of women's contributions to the library, um, this visualization, and I'm going to um, spend a bit of time on it because it does really emphasize. And the first thing to say is that this column represents the ground floor of the library, and this one represents the balcony. So I'll go back. So we see we have a ground floor row of books and a row of books on the balcony, and those shelves expand all the way around the room. And you can see actually here on this image that the books downstairs are larger than the books upstairs. Um, and that's why there are more of them on this side. And one book is made up of a square roughly the size of these patches that I'm showing you here. And each line in this visualization is one bookcase, sorry, one shelf on the bookcase. So this here, for example, is a shelf with a very small number of very large books. And on the other side, we've got a shelf with a very large number of very small books. Um, and I've done this in order to get an idea at a glance of what proportion of the collection were books once owned by women. The grey ones are not included in this project because they're published after 1714. So those are later books. And the green ones are books that were published before 1715. So I looked at and were not owned by women. And the orange ones are the books that are owned by women. The vast majority of those are downstairs, and that's because those are the books that came from Lady Grace Pierrepont. Lord Dorchester collected mainly large books. But you can see in the space upstairs, there are a handful of smaller books that were once owned by women. We thought at the beginning that we would find more books upstairs, so more smaller books upstairs than larger books downstairs that were owned by women. And this is because women had less space of their own to store their belongings. And in fact, if you remove the books that came from Lady Grace Pierrepont, who was an unusual example, then the majority of the books were actually upstairs, so that women's books do tend to be smaller. The blue ones here are examples of books that were not on the shelves for various reasons. For example, they were being lent to another exhibition at the time. So I think this quite abstract representation of the library really makes it clear just how dependent on books that were once owned by women this very masculine presentation of a gentleman's library is. Which is one of the reasons why I'm planning to replicate this visualization in reality in the library. And the work for that will be done this summer, and the exhibition is going to open next autumn. On the other side of my slide, I've listed here some of the names of women that I found when going through the books. And the list really makes it clear how challenging it is to take a name that's been written in a book and then go off and find that person. Some of them Elizabeth the First is in here, are quite obvious. So notable people, those who members of the aristocracy or royalty are easy to trace. Later women, so Dr. McAlpine here and Dr. Niven were both fellows of the Royal College of Physicians who donated books. So they are modern women who have collected older books. That's easier to track down than early modern women. But despite the fact that I just have a name to start from, we have actually been able to track down and triangulate sources to sketch out the lives of some of the women that owned these books. I'm going to go through some of that in the next few slides. So here are some examples. Sarah Downing I've put in as an example because it's an example of a later hand. So this is probably a 20th century hand owning an older object. So relatively easy to track down modern women owners. And we can contrast that with Elizabeth Ashton here. This is a French cookery or regimen book that includes recipes for maintaining good health that was once owned by Elizabeth Ashton. Elizabeth Ashton is quite interesting. I didn't think it would be possible to track her down, but it turns out that there are a limited number of Elizabeth Ashtons to look through. And we think that this particular book came from a collection of objects that were once owned by Elizabeth Ashton, who was relatively wealthy and was keen for her things to be kept together after her death. So she had a collection of mainly of books, but of other interesting objects as well. And her will specified that the collection was to be kept together, and she left everything to her nephew. The collection has clearly been dispersed, and there's an interesting contrast to be drawn there between how women's collections are maintained versus how men's collections are maintained. And it is far more common within institutions to find clusters of objects that were owned by the same man than it is to find clusters of objects that were owned by the same woman. Partly because women had less usually, and partly because of the value that is attached to collecting activities by men versus collecting activities by women. And the collection that was given by Lady Grace Pierrepont is quite an exceptional example, although we have to acknowledge that while she owned that collection, it doesn't reflect her own collecting activities. So it's a little bit of a red herring in that respect. Um, these are examples of inscriptions where I can tell you that the book was owned by a woman, and that we haven't been able to track down individual women more than that. They're quite often inscriptions and comments in the book, and sometimes written by multiple women. So we have a difference of opinion as to whether this is one person practicing writing and seeing different hands, or whether there is more than one Anne that owned this book. So I'm not convinced that this signature is the same as that one. And we have other examples of individual books that have multiple women's names in that have clearly been passed along between women in families or friendship groups. And this sort of inscription is one of the reasons why women's ownership of books and engagement with them has been dismissed historically. So the consensus previously has been that quite often women would practice writing in their books, but that doesn't mean that they read the book or understood what was written in it, which is a pretty dismissive attitude. So the assumption was that if a man wrote his name in the book, that he owned it and he knew what was in it and he had read it. But if the woman wrote her name in the book, then maybe she was just practicing her handwriting. And there's no reason to assume one thing or another, and it's perfectly plausible that Anne Mariam read and understood the contents of her book as it is for any man writing his name in the book. This inscription highlights one of the particular challenges of working with early modern texts, so texts and objects from the 16th, 17th century. There was a remarkable amount of linguistic diversity amongst those who were well educated. So a lot of the texts that I've been working with are not in English. There's a lot of French and Italian texts, a handful in German, and many, many texts in Latin and Greek. And the inscriptions, of course, are also not always in English. So we have some French inscriptions here as well. So you have to be on your toes when looking through this sort of material to be receptive and not dismiss texts that are not immediately understandable, and to make sure that texts that are in other inscriptions that are not written in English are not dismissed either. This is Catherine Dupuy, who wrote in French in her books. And here we have some more examples just to give an idea of the range of the sorts of inscriptions. Elizabeth Skipp, Mary Prideaux, and Sarah Paramore have all written their names towards the beginning of the book. And so the most obvious place to look for an inscription is on the title page, as here, or in the front matter, so the pages at the beginning of the book that don't have any printing on. But if you restrict your inspection to that area, you will miss an awful lot of information. And I've found plenty of inscriptions in very unexpected places in the book, sometimes right in the middle of the book. So Anne Holland, for example, wrote her name part of the way through the book, and quite a few women, Eleanor Austen is an example of this, wrote their names at the end of the book. So if you just take the books down and look at the title page and the front matter, then you miss that evidence of engagement. And part of this is because the books themselves are not stable objects. We think of a book as a single thing that we buy, that's bound and glued and fixed together. And that's a relatively recent development. And at the time when most of these books were printed, they would be bought as a pile of paper, and you had to pay more for the binding. So it was a marker of wealth to have expensive bindings and to be able to dictate the sort of bindings that you wanted for your books and to have your bindings all matching. There was also a healthy used book market, and some of these used books were bound and some were not. And the bindings are also not stable over time. So many of these books don't have their original bindings. You can just see the edge of an original binding there, but a lot of them have been rebound quite commonly in the 19th or in the 20th century. Here's an example of someone that it was easy to track down, and I've included this here because it's also the only example within the collection of two things that I thought I might see more of. So the first is book plates. So this is the only woman's book plate that I found when going through all of these books, and that may be because book plates became fashionable a bit later into the 18th century, although plenty of men had them earlier. So, if I looked at later books, I might find more examples of these. And it was also the only example, other than Grace Pierrepont, where I found more than one book that was owned by the same woman. And again, it's not a typical example. This is, of course, a member of the aristocracy, and pretty easy to track down. She was painted by Joshua Reynolds and also by Angelica Kaufman. And when you have clear documentation of a name, and um, when that person is identifiable in the archive, it is far easier to tell the story of their objects than when, for example, you have a situation like Elizabeth Ashton, which took a lot more effort at triangulation to pin her down. And for some of these examples, it's proven to be not possible. So I can't track down and locate for sure Sarah Paramore or the Amphisilus or Anne Holland because there just isn't enough information to do that. And also the what archive material there is not adequate. Because we don't know whether they were married, and their their activities quite often were documented via their husband's name. So it's not possible to link them in that way, but they will now be acknowledged within the catalogue of the college. So at least the ownership of their objects will be incorporated into the historical record. Mary Culpeper is another interesting example. The Culpeper family is well known, particularly for Nicholas Culpeper, who wrote a dispensary, published that in English, and wound up the Royal College of Physicians extensively by practicing outside of the city walls so that they could not restrict his activities. And it was a publishing phenomenon. I believe Culpeper's Herbal is still in print now. And Mary Culpeper, as far as I have been able to work out based on the provenance information for this particular object, was his mother. So that it's an interesting way to be able to link very influential behavior and activities within the history of medicine back to the back to a woman who has not yet featured in the story. Mary Culpeper is acknowledged by Nicholas Culpeper as a source of a lot of his knowledge. She was consulted by people in her village for her skills with herbs. So clearly an influence on her son, who then went on to publish a dispensary and also many texts on midwifery. Here is an example of that dispensary by Nicholas Culpeper that was owned by Anne Smythe, who very kindly wrote her name right at the beginning, so it was nice and easy to find. And this is my final example, and I wanted to include it because it is one of the women's health books that we found that was once owned by a woman, and it brings up all kinds of interesting questions. The first is the inscription, which made me laugh. I brought this book at London for my wife, April 1713. And the text is a lay guide to women's health problems, including infections and period problems. And it doesn't seem to be a particularly romantic gift, but it does open up all kinds of questions about ordinary people and what they knew about medicine. So this text was aimed at a lay audience. And what's really interesting about it is that it doesn't exist anywhere else. So this this copy is unique. There aren't any copies anywhere else. And despite the fact that the inscription is anonymous, because the documentation of the acquisition of this book is very good, and the documentation for the collection that it used to be in is very good. It's possible for me to trace the story of this book from 1711 when it was printed right up until today. So there are no gaps in the history of this object, despite the fact that the inscription here is anonymous. And it has also been possible to identify the anonymous woman that it was intended for, we think. So watch this space for that. And just to give some idea of the scale, I'll go back to the visualization. Um, there are 7,000 books approximately, and excluding the bulk of these orange ones, which are the ones that came from Grace Pierrepont, 29% of them had evidence related to provenance, so evidence that tells me who it once belonged to. And of those, only 45 in total were owned by women. So although there are a lot of orange squares here, most of those are from Grace Pierrepont, and the other orange squares are from other women. And of those 45 books, 31 of them are classified as medical sciences, including women's health, 3 of them as home economics and domestic science and housekeeping, 3 as religion, 2 as poetry, 1 as biographical studies, 1 as geography, 1 of linguistics, and 1 of mathematics. So there are far fewer women's health texts than we first expected. And I have to say that when I first started doing this, I expected that I would have fewer of these sorts of general medical texts, like the Mary Culpeper books, and more of the texts like this, which is a women's health text. But that assumption doesn't hold out. So it challenges really a long-held assumption that women's interest and experience of medicine was limited to women's health, because actually the majority of the books that were owned by women were medical, and the majority of them were general medicine rather than women's health medicine. And this is not because I've looked in the Royal College of Physicians rather than another collection. So you might think that we would find more evidence of women owning women's health texts if, for example, we looked in the RCOG library or the Wellcome library. But in fact, the RCP library is incredibly rich in historic text about women's health. And the reason for that is quite idiosyncratic, and it's due to an argument between a group of obstetricians and gynecologists in the 20th century when the RCOG was founded. And 2 of the obstetricians who disagreed with the decision to found a college of obstetrics and gynecology were collectors of historic books. And they felt snubbed by the founders of the RCOG, so they left their collections to the Royal College of Physicians instead, which is why the RCP has a particularly high quantity of women's health books within its collection. So it's not the case that the reason that we didn't find more examples of women owning women's health books was because there weren't any women's health books to look at. It's just that women's interests are far broader than perhaps we give them credit for here. And I think, yep, and finally just want to acknowledge the people that have been supporting me with this work. It's been incredibly disrupted for the Royal College of Physicians, and we started doing this in autumn 2019, so it was massively disrupted again by the pandemic. And Katie Birkwood is the in charge of the Rare Book Library and has been facilitating my access to it. Elizabeth Savage is an historian of print and the book at the Institute of English Studies, which holds the grant that is paying for this work. And Laura Gowing is an historian of women's bodies and of early modern women at King's College, who's also been supporting us. And it's all been funded by London Arts and Humanities Partnership, which is which gets its money from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So thank you very much. And I would be happy to take any questions. I don't know how to. Ooh. Hi, Anna. Oh, hang on.
Anna, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. Fantastic. Really, really interesting. And I've been into the RCP and I will go into it again with new eyes that you've really opened up um, the history of that, which is absolutely fantastic. I mean, amazing. I wanted to ask, what's your view on the sort of breadth of what women were interested in their books? I mean, it sounds as though it's nutrition, but not just healing arts, herbal treatments. Was it was it very generic, very general, or was there a little bit more interest in, for example, maternity, birth, that kind of.
That's what we thought. And that's
Mm.
also kind of what I hoped in a way, given my own background. But that's not what I found. And I think that what that means is that we have all kinds of assumption about what women ought to be interested in. And we all know that if we get a group of women together, they will have a range of interests. And I think that's what this demonstrates. And the other thing that it demonstrates is that um, until we ask the question, we just don't know. It's a snapshot, and history is skewed. It's biased towards what is left. So I can tell you um, who what the books were that women wrote their names in. I don't know whether the books without a woman's name were also owned by women. It is far more of it seems to be, and this is another assumption, but it's probably a closer one. It's far more a masculine thing to write a name in a book. Collecting at that time was a very masculine activity, and having a collection that was displayed publicly was a very masculine activity. It wasn't so much a feminine activity, which doesn't mean that women didn't collect things, including books, but the collections were smaller. They tended to be, rather than displayed in a big library that everyone could see when they came into a big house, women kept their books in trunks and trousseaux and in the bedroom, in the closet, actually. It's called the closet. So they were smaller in size and in smaller numbers. Um, and we can only recreate collections where women have written their names, and those are actually quite unusual. So I really thought that I would find more.
Yeah. And
So it,
have you found, I mean, look, thinking about other countries, are there any other similar sort of findings, or there are similar, in other countries, for example, in the Netherlands and in Belgium? Because I know you've been over to the Netherlands where
yeah,
you did
yeah,
this
I've done some work in
research.
the Netherlands. So
Yeah.
as far as we know, this is the first time that anyone has done anything like this. So collection level research is very expensive, and it requires quite a broad range of skills that it's quite difficult to get in one person. And it is often better to have the same person or small group of people going through things, because then you get consistency in approach. Um, so and it requires buy-in from the institution. So the RCP committed to having someone there in a way that was going to be disruptive, but I don't think anyone, including me, knew quite how disruptive this was going to be. It's been massively disruptive to the to how they run their business. And it's very difficult to get collections to agree to do that. So this is the first time that anyone has done this from this way. The other way of doing it is to say, well, I'm going to sit at home or in a room and I'm going to look at the catalogue. Um, and that's been done quite a lot more. And actually, someone did that more recently at UCL. And then you capture what somebody has written in the catalogue, but you miss what anyone has decided not to put in the catalogue, which is really what this project is about. I mean, there are all kinds of other things that I did whilst I was going through the books to make the activity worthwhile. going to pop that one back on just so you can see that there are a huge variety in their physical state, and some of them are quite fragile. So actually taking them down and looking at every single page is quite intrusive and invasive. And so we wanted to get as much information as possible. So I've got 50,000 images of to wade through. I like data, but this is it's something
Even for
else.
you, that's
Even for
something
me, it's really something else.
Really.
So yeah, nobody has done this physical inspection before, and it's some of those books have clearly never been read, like the pages have never been opened. So, and clearly I was the first person in hundreds of years to look through some of them, and I don't think anyone has ever looked through as many of them as I have. It is a little bit overwhelming, but it has generated far more questions perhaps than it's answered, but it has also demonstrated also how much we assume rather than know about what women were doing at that time. So I assumed it would be women's health, and actually there was a whole lot of academic medicine. Um, and the one thing that there's not there, which is perhaps related to the bias of the collection because of Lord Dorchester, was law. There's a funny sort of overlap between medical collections that have legal holdings and legal collections that have medical holdings, and that just reflects the kind of education that professionals had to have in the early modern period. Because Lord Dorchester was a legal scholar, there are an awful lot of law books there. And there are other law books that didn't come from him, but none of those had women's names in. So women didn't seem to be interested in the law, or if they were, they didn't admit to it by writing their names in their books.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Penny. I don't know if there are any other questions. No, well, perhaps you can show your appreciation. It's always very difficult to do clapping, but thank you very much, Penny. Absolutely brilliant, really
Thank you.
interesting, and delighted that you could come and tell us about this project. And what's the final thing that you're going to be doing with it? What's the next steps?
The next step is the installation.
Yeah.
So we got the money for that. That was approved last week. And that will pay for me to hire a bunch of PhD students to come and help me, because physically wrapping all those books is going to be a massive task. We're going to do that in the summer, and the exhibition will open in
And how can
September.
people sign up to that if they want to come?
I
and
will
see
send
modern
an
books?
invite. Yeah, I'll send an invite round.
Sounds
Do
brilliant.
come and see it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, Kate said thank you, Penny. Yeah, brilliant. And I'll see you soon.
Yes, thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye.